The Green River Killer is the moniker given to an unidentified serial killer who operated in Washington state in the 1980s and 90s. He was so named because many of his victims were found along the banks of the Green River in King County, just south of Seattle. At last count, he had been linked to at least 49 murders, but investigators believe that the real number of his victims could be much higher, perhaps as many as 90 or more. The case remains officially unsolved, although Gary Ridgway has confessed to being the killer and is currently serving 49 life sentences in Washington State's Greenhaven prison. Most of the victims were young women who had run away from home or who were involved in the sex trade. The case went cold after only a few months, and it looked like the killer would get away with his crimes. His parents divorced when he was only 2 years old, and he spent the majority of his childhood living with his father and stepmother in the Seattle suburb of Sk. As a child, Ridgway was described as being extremely violent. He often beat up other children and even his own sister, all of which took place between 1984 and 1998. Investigators believe that the real number of his victims could be as high as 90. As I mentioned earlier, the case against Ridgway is not without its flaws. While DNA evidence does link him to some of the murders, it doesn't link him to all of them. In this interview, Ridgway essentially confessed to the murders. However, when detectives asked him specific questions about certain murders, such as the time and location of the murder, how the victim died, and whether or not he had any accomplices, Ridgway refused to answer. It seems likely that Ridgway targeted these women because they were easy prey. After all, the evidence against him is far from airtight. Whether he confesses or not, he will die behind bars. The case against him is strong, but far from airtight. There is still room to doubt. He refused to answer specific questions about the murders, and the DNA evidence only links him to about half of the murders he allegedly committed. Do you think Gary Ridgway is actually the Green River Killer? Or do you think he was wrongly convicted? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Additionally, the victims in this case do not fit the profile of a typical serial killer's victims. Could it be that the police arrested the wrong man? No one was going to miss them, and the police would never suspect that a killer was on the loose. But here's the thing. As I mentioned earlier, one victim was a 19-year-old high school student who had not run away, and another was a 31-year-old mother of two whose husband was a police officer. So clearly, Ridgway was not targeting runaway or prostitute women exclusively. Yet the majority of the victims in this case are either runaways or prostitutes. Does this not seem a bit suspicious? Instead, he invoked his right to remain silent. This is very strange behavior for someone who is actually guilty. After all, if he had nothing to hide, he would want to clear his name, right? Why would he refuse to answer questions about his alleged crimes? In fact, the evidence only links him to about half of the murders that he confessed to. This has led some people to believe that Ridgway may have been wrongly convicted of some of the murders, or even that he may not be guilty of any of them at all. In fact, when Ridgway was finally caught and interviewed by police, he admitted to having killed at least 90 women during the course of his 15-year killing spree. The youngest victim he claimed to have killed was only 14 years old. One time he beat up his sister so badly that she required hospitalization. When he was 13 years old, he was arrested for assaulting a neighbor with a baseball bat. To answer this question, we need to take a closer look at the evidence against Ridgway and see if it really is as damning as it seems. Despite all of this, Ridgway was able to graduate from high school and eventually get a job working as a truck painter at the Kenworth Truck Company in Washington. It was here that he met his future wife, Claudia Marie, and the two were soon married. As I mentioned earlier, DNA evidence does link Ridgway to some of the murders, but it doesn't link him to all of them. In fact, the DNA evidence only links him to about half of the murders that he confessed to. What's more, the DNA evidence does not link him to any of the murders that took place before 1987. And yet, according to Ridgway himself, he began killing in 1984. So why would the DNA evidence only link him to half of the murders he allegedly committed over a 15-year span? They had 2 sons together, but the marriage was far from a happy one. According to friends of the couple, they constantly argued and Gary was often unfaithful. Then, in 2001, a breakthrough finally occurred. Police were able to link several of the killings to a single person through DNA evidence, and the man they were looking for was Gary Ridgway. However, one victim was a 19-year-old high school student who had not run away, and another was a 31-year-old mother of 2 whose husband was a police officer. All of them had been strangled to death with a piece of wire. But that doesn't mean that the case is closed. There are still plenty of unanswered questions surrounding the case of the Green River Killer. What was the killer's motive? How did he choose his victims? And why was he able to go undetected for so long? This move would prove to be very fortuitous for the women of Seattle. You see, around this time, the Green River Killer had begun his killing spree, and had already murdered at least 12 women. It seems likely that the stress of his failing marriage drove Ridgway to seek solace in the arms of prostitutes, but instead of paying them for their company, he paid them with his life. In this video, we're going to try and shed some light on these dark secrets, but a word of warning before we begin. This case involves the sexual assault and murder of women. Some of the details are quite graphic and disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. The Green River Killer operated primarily in the Seattle metropolitan area during the 1980s and 90s. His first victim was a 16-year-old runaway named Mary Ann Click. Her body was found on the banks of the Green River in May of 1982. She had been strangled with a piece of wire. At the time, police believed that she had been killed by a transient who had come across her while she was out walking alone at night. They didn't connect her deaths to the following similar cases until much later. This was a time when the city was experiencing rapid growth and change. For decades, Seattle had been known as a quiet, sleepy town, but it was quickly becoming a major metropolis. This influx of new residents led to increased gang activity, drug use, and prostitution. In order to fully appreciate the bizarre aspects of this case, it's important to know a little bit about the area where the crimes took place. It was in this environment that the Green River Killer began his reign of terror. Over the next 2 decades, 48 more women would be found dead in a similar manner, strangled with a piece of wire, discarded along the banks of the Green River, and in several other locations around the Seattle area. It soon became apparent that there was a serial killer on the loose, but despite an extensive manhunt, police were unable to catch him. Gary Ridgway was born on February 23, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Despite his troubled personal life, Gary Ridgway continued to work at the Kenworth Truck Company until 1987, when he transferred to a different department that didn't require him to paint trucks. To date, Gary Ridgway has been charged with 49 murders. Ridgway was eventually sentenced to 49 life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each of the murders he was convicted of. So what really happened in this case? Was Gary Ridgway actually the Green River Killer, or was he just a convenient scapegoat for the police? One of the main pieces of evidence against Ridgway is a videotaped interview that he did with detectives in 2001. Another piece of evidence against Ridgway is the DNA evidence itself. Finally, let's consider the victims themselves. All of them were young women who had run away from home or were involved in the sex trade. Could it be that the police, desperate to solve this case, latched on to Gary Ridgway as their prime suspect and then coerced him into confessing to the murders? Unfortunately, we may never know for sure. Gary Ridgway is currently serving 49 life sentences in Washington State's Green Haven Prison and is not eligible for parole. Now, what do you think?